The sun rose harshly over the hills of Judea, casting the land in a stark, unyielding light. Judea, a region filled with history and deep religious roots, was a province under the vast expanse of the Roman Empire. The people here clung fiercely to their customs, their God and their way of life, viewing outsiders with distrust, and Romans most of all. To them, Rome represented oppression and idolatry, an empire that enforced worship of strange gods and emperors who declared themselves divine. In their minds, it was a realm opposed to everything they held sacred. Into this tension-filled land arrived Pontius Pilate, a Roman governor tasked with maintaining control over Judea. Pilate was neither a cruel nor a particularly lenient man by nature, but he was ambitious and aware of his own position within Rome's power structure. Serving as prefect of Judea was a test of his loyalty and competence. If he succeeded, it could lead to greater appointments. But the province was a powder keg, and Pilate knew that his every decision would be scrutinized, both by the locals and by his superiors in Rome. As governor, Pilate faced a challenge that required not only political strength, but also a sensitivity to a people whose culture he neither understood nor respected deeply. Rome expected him to govern with an iron hand, ensuring taxes flowed back to the capital, and that no uprisings disrupted the peace of the empire. But the people of Judea were prone to rebellion, and Rome was wary of religious zealots who could incite the masses. When Pilate first arrived, he observed the customs of the Jewish people with detached curiosity. Their single-minded devotion to one God, their dietary restrictions, their holy days, these were foreign to Pilate, who had grown up amid the temples and statues of Rome's many gods. To him, the people of Judea seemed stubborn, unyielding, and fixated on a God that seemed to demand constant attention. Yet he could not ignore their power to stir crowds and ignite passions. He learned quickly that this was a people for whom faith was inseparable from identity, politics, and daily life. In those early days, Pilate worked to establish his authority, sometimes with too heavy a hand. When he ordered Roman standards bearing images of the emperor to be placed within Jerusalem, it sparked outrage. The people viewed such images as idolatrous, and their outcry was immediate and intense. Thousands gathered in protest, some even willing to risk their lives. For days they surrounded his headquarters, refusing to leave. Pilate watched them, both impressed and annoyed by their resolve. He could have ordered his soldiers to disperse them by force, yet something in their devotion made him hesitate. It was his first lesson in governing Judea. Force could break bodies, but not beliefs. The incident marked the beginning of a tense relationship. Pilate was no stranger to using power, but he recognized that he could not afford open rebellion in a land so steeped in faith and pride. He knew that in the eyes of the Judeans, he would always be an outsider, a symbol of the empire they despised. His title might have given him authority, but in the people's eyes it only underscored his foreignness, his inability to understand their sacred traditions. In the quiet moments, Pilate sometimes felt the weight of his isolation. He was miles from Rome, surrounded by a people who would never truly accept him. Though he had loyal soldiers and Roman advisors, he felt no kinship here. The locals viewed him with suspicion, and the local leaders, such as the high priests of the temple, seemed to harbor their own hidden agendas. Pilate learned quickly that these priests wielded significant influence, often more than he could in his position. They had the loyalty of the people, and could incite or quell a crowd with a single word. Despite his attempts to maintain order, Pilate's relationship with the Jewish leaders remained fraught. He had clashed with them over the use of temple funds to build an aqueduct, an act he believed would benefit the region by bringing fresh water to the people. Yet they saw it as theft, an affront to their sacred treasury. The resulting uproar left Pilate embittered. He viewed the leaders as obstinate, blinded by tradition. To him, they seemed to cling to rituals and laws with no regard for progress or practical needs. This continual friction weighed on him, adding to a mounting frustration. Pilate was a man of duty, and his role demanded strict obedience to Rome. But in Judea, obedience often came at a high price. He faced decisions where every option seemed fraught with consequence. Too much leniency risked the disapproval of Rome, while too much severity threatened to inflame the locals. It was a balance he struggled to maintain. As the months turned into years, Pilate became accustomed to the endless negotiations and compromises that his position required. His wife Claudia had joined him in Judea, offering him comfort and companionship, though she too felt the strain of living in a place where they would always be foreigners. Claudia was a woman of strong intuition, often sensing tensions before they came to a head. Though she rarely spoke of her feelings about the people of Judea, Pilate could tell that she, too, was unsettled by the atmosphere of distrust and unrest that seemed to permeate their lives. In his quieter moments, Pilate sometimes wondered about the God of the Jews. It seemed strange to him that a people would worship a deity with such fierce devotion, one who demanded absolute loyalty and obedience. He had heard of prophets and messiahs who claimed to speak on behalf of this God, men who stirred the people with visions of deliverance and freedom from Rome. Though he dismissed such talk as superstition, he could not ignore the power it held over the people. One day, Pilate received reports of a new prophet named Jesus, a man from Galilee who spoke in parables and gathered crowds wherever he went. At first, Pilate paid little attention. Prophets and teachers were not uncommon in Judea, and they rarely posed any threat to Roman rule. But the reports grew more frequent, and rumors began to spread that this man performed miracles, healed the sick, and even raised the dead. Pilate listened to these reports with a mix of amusement and mild concern. He doubted the truth of the miracles, dismissing them as exaggerations or tricks. Yet he could not ignore the influence this Jesus seemed to wield. The Jewish leaders, he was told, were increasingly alarmed by the man's popularity and the way he seemed to challenge the authority of the temple. They spoke of him as a troublemaker, a potential threat to their power and the fragile stability of the region. As Pilate read the reports, he could feel the weight of another conflict looming on the horizon. This Jesus of Nazareth was not like the other prophets. He seemed to possess a rare and unusual authority that drew people to him. Pilate sensed that before long he would be forced to confront this man and decide his fate. And so in the tense and shifting landscape of Judea, Pilate waited, not knowing that his encounter with Jesus would be the event that defined his life, the moment that would seal his place in history. Pontius Pilate's arrival in Judea was meant to be a testament to his loyalty and strength as a governor. Pilate was appointed as the 5th prefect of Judea by Emperor Tiberius, and this role was, by all appearances, a significant step forward in his career. In Rome, he had been a relatively minor official, his reputation barely noticeable among the elite of the empire. But Judea offered him something different, a chance to stand out, to prove himself worthy of higher ranks within the empire. However, this province was unlike any Pilate had ever governed or studied. Rome had expanded across vast lands, incorporating diverse cultures, religions, and languages under its rule. Yet none had been as unyielding as Judea, a place where political authority constantly collided with an ancient faith that governed the lives of its people more rigidly than any Roman law. In his early days, Pilate made note of the odd balance of power in Judea. While he held the supreme Roman authority, he was constantly challenged by the high priests and religious leaders who, though officially his subordinates, wielded a grip on the people's hearts and minds that he could never quite match. Pilate's first test came with his decision to station Roman troops in Jerusalem and to display Roman standards bearing the image of Emperor Tiberius in the Holy City. To Pilate, this was a symbolic act, a show of Rome's dominance that could help deter any rebellious sentiments among the locals, but he underestimated how deeply this would offend the people. To them, these standards were more than symbols of political power. They were idols. For the devout in Judea, images of a living man declared a god, even their distant emperor, were a violation of their commandment against graven images. Within days, a crowd had gathered outside Pilate's residence in Caesarea, demanding the removal of the standards. Pilate was initially taken aback by their reaction. He had dealt with uprisings before, but the fervor here was different. The people were not simply angry, they were outraged. Their protests were not a simple act of defiance against Roman authority, but a plea for the sanctity of their faith. Pilate was not one to bend easily. A show of defiance required a show of strength, he believed. He ordered his soldiers to surround the demonstrators, preparing to use force to break up the gathering. Yet when his soldiers raised their weapons, something remarkable happened. The protesters, thousands of them, dropped to their knees, baring their necks in surrender. They were prepared to die, every last one of them. Rather than allow these foreign symbols to defile their holy city, Pilate felt a rare moment of doubt. He had seen defiance before, even courage, but never this kind of unwavering devotion. He could have ordered his soldiers to strike, to make an example of these people, but he sensed that such a massacre would only lead to greater unrest and bloodshed. Reluctantly, Pilate ordered the standards to be withdrawn from Jerusalem. The people dispersed, and he learned his first lesson in the art of governance in Judea. Force was not always the answer. Despite this incident, Pilate was not swayed from his belief in Roman authority. He understood now that the people of Judea were unlike any others in the empire. Their devotion to their God made them unpredictable, their loyalty to their faith greater than their fear of death. Yet he believed he could bring them to heel, with a combination of firm rule and occasional compromise. It was a precarious balancing act, one that he would struggle to maintain. His next significant challenge came when he decided to finance an aqueduct to bring fresh water into Jerusalem. In Pilate's mind, this was a beneficial project that would improve the quality of life for the local population. But the funds he intended to use for this endeavor were taken from the temple treasury to Pilate. This seemed practical. The temple amassed considerable wealth, and using it for a project that would benefit the public was, to him, a logical decision. However, to the Jewish leaders and the people, it was a sacrilegious act, a theft from God. Protests erupted once more, and Pilate's patience wore thin. This time he was determined to assert his authority. He ordered his soldiers to disguise themselves in civilian clothing, mingling with the protesters, each soldier hiding a weapon beneath his cloak. At Pilate's signal, they were to subdue the crowd with violence. When the demonstration reached a peak, the soldiers struck, emerging from the throngs and attacking the protesters. Many were killed or wounded, and the rest scattered in terror. While the aqueduct was completed, the cost to Pilate's reputation was immense. The people of Judea now saw him not only as an outsider, but as a defiler of their sacred temple. The high priests, who wielded significant influence over the population, grew more hostile toward him. Pilate sensed the animosity in their eyes whenever he was forced to meet with them, their veiled contempt growing with each new decree he imposed. He knew he had made powerful enemies, yet he could not allow their traditions to supersede Roman law and order. In his private moments, Pilate began to feel a growing frustration. Governing Judea was nothing like he had imagined. It was exhausting, relentless, and fraught with complications that no amount of Roman training had prepared him for. In the quiet of his residence, he sometimes confided in his wife, Claudia. Unlike her husband, Claudia had a cautious respect for the people's faith. She sensed something profound in their devotion, something that was perhaps beyond her understanding, but deserving of respect. Claudia often urged Pilate to approach his decisions with care, warning him of the consequences of disrespecting their deeply held beliefs. Pilate, however, was a man of Rome. To him, the empire represented order and civilization, the foundation upon which the world's future was built. He found it difficult to view the customs of Judea as anything more than archaic traditions, barriers to progress that he was forced to work around. And yet, deep down, Pilate was beginning to sense that Judea was a place of mysteries beyond his grasp. He could see it in the eyes of the priests, in the chants of the people as they prayed, in the quiet power that seemed to radiate from the temple itself. But he was a governor, not a mystic. His role was to enforce Rome's will, not to understand the faith of a conquered people. Months turned into years, and Pilate continued to govern with a mixture of firmness and frustration. The incidents with the standards and the aqueduct faded from immediate memory, but the resentment they had sown remained. Pilate had left scars on the province, scars that the people would not forget. His relationship with the Jewish leaders deteriorated further, each side viewing the other with suspicion and contempt. To Pilate, they were obstructive and hypocritical, clinging to ancient laws while seeking favors from Rome when it suited them. To the priests, Pilate was a foreigner with no respect for their God or their people, a man who governed by fear rather than understanding. Through it all, Pilate clung to the belief that he was serving Rome with honor. He would carry out his duties, maintain order, and ensure that Judea remained a compliant part of the empire. And if he faced opposition, he would quash it, for he was Rome's hand in this distant, troubled land. Yet, beneath his determination lay a growing unease, an awareness that he was playing a dangerous game in a land where unseen forces and ancient beliefs held sway. In the third year of his governorship, as tensions in Judea simmered, news came of a new prophet, a man from Galilee named Jesus, whose teachings were spreading through the countryside. Pilate dismissed the early reports as rumors of yet another zealot stirring up the people, yet he could not ignore the growing number of followers this Jesus attracted. People spoke of miracles and healings, of words that moved crowds to tears and lifted spirits weighed down by years of oppression. Pilate paid little attention to the man at first, seeing him as no different from the countless other prophets and rabbis who wandered Judea. Yet he could not have foreseen how this man, this prophet from a small town, would soon stand before him, forcing him to confront the very core of his beliefs, his fears, and his role in this unforgiving land. In time, the name Jesus would come to dominate Pilate's life, reshaping his fate in ways he could not yet imagine. As the years passed, Pilate found himself continuously at odds with Judea's religious leaders and the increasingly volatile populace. The demands of governance weighed heavily upon him, yet amidst this chaos, news of a new figure began to spread across the region. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, and his presence would prove to be the catalyst that transformed Pilate's life and ultimately sealed his fate. Reports about Jesus began subtly, almost unnoticeably, filtering through the towns and into the courts. Pilate dismissed him as a passing zealot, assuming he would fade from the people's consciousness like so many others before him. Judea, he reasoned, was filled with prophets and teachers, each claiming to hold truths that would redeem the people from Rome's grasp. Yet as months passed, the rumors grew more insistent, more intriguing. The man from Galilee, it was said, did not just preach, he performed miracles. He healed the sick, restored sight to the blind, and even brought the dead back to life. And as his teaching spread, so did the following around him. Entire villages traveled to hear him speak, captivated by his words and comforted by his promise of hope, peace, and salvation. But there was something more. Jesus' words cut deeper than those of any prophet Pilate had heard of before. He spoke of a kingdom, yet it was not the kind of kingdom that threatened Rome's power, at least not in the way Pilate understood it. Instead, he spoke of the kingdom of heaven, a place where the meek would inherit the earth, the oppressed would be lifted, and the last would be made first. For a man of Pilate's background, steeped in Roman politics and power, such words seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet, for the people of Judea, these words carried a promise of liberation beyond mere politics. Pilate's advisors urged him to be cautious. Jesus might not lead an army or openly incite rebellion, but his influence was undeniable, and it had a power that even Pilate, despite his experience, found difficult to counter. The high priests were especially troubled. This new teacher challenged their authority, and his popularity grew each day, drawing away followers from the traditional teachings that upheld the authority of the temple. Some feared that if he continued, he could disrupt the precarious peace they had managed to maintain with Rome. The priests came to Pilate, urging him to act. They warned him that Jesus' words were dangerously subversive, that his teachings could inspire rebellion against Rome's rule. But Pilate remained cautious. Judea had been plagued by religious zealots and false messiahs before, and he had dealt with them by swift and brutal means. But this man seemed different. He was not a warrior or an insurrectionist. Pilate saw no immediate threat to Rome's power, only a man speaking of peace and forgiveness. Pilate decided to keep his distance, observing from afar but unwilling to intervene. Yet, days turned into weeks, and Jesus continued his teachings, moving closer to Jerusalem. Pilate was informed of his arrival by spies and informants, who reported that crowds had lined the streets to welcome him, laying palm branches before him as he entered the city. The people called him King of the Jews, a title that caught Pilate's attention, and set the high priests on edge. To the Roman governor, the title seemed laughable. This was no king. He had no army, no fortress, no palace. Yet Pilate couldn't help but be intrigued by the power of his influence. The tension in Jerusalem grew. Pilate's presence in the city was more ceremonial than practical, as he preferred to govern from his coastal residence in Caesarea. But the festival of Passover was approaching, and the city was filled with pilgrims from across Judea and beyond, all gathering to celebrate. Pilate knew that Passover, a time when the people commemorated their liberation from bondage in Egypt, held special meaning for the Jews. And with Jesus in the city, the atmosphere was charged, electric with anticipation and perhaps a hint of rebellion. As Passover began, the chief priests came to Pilate with a request that went beyond simple advice. They demanded Jesus' arrest, presenting him as a dangerous agitator whose presence threatened both the temple's authority and Rome's peace. Pilate was reluctant. He saw no crime in the man, no act that merited execution. Yet the priests pressed on, warning Pilate that if he allowed this so-called king of the Jews to continue, it would be seen as a direct challenge to Rome's rule. Pilate sensed a trap. The high priests did not truly care about Rome. Their concern was their own authority, and Jesus was undermining it. Despite his instincts, Pilate acquiesced. He ordered Jesus' arrest, intending to question him and perhaps find a way to placate the priests without resorting to execution. When Jesus was brought before him, Pilate found himself unexpectedly moved. The man was quiet, humble, and serene, displaying none of the defiance Pilate expected. He questioned Jesus about his claim to kingship, asking, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not of this world." The words hung in the air, their meaning unclear to Pilate, but laden with an authority that troubled him. Pilate's mind wrestled with the decision. On one hand, he saw no fault in this man. On the other, the priests and the crowd outside clamored for his death. Pilate's wife, Claudia, had warned him earlier that day, recounting a troubling dream she had about Jesus. "Have nothing to do with that innocent man," she had said. But Pilate, trapped between duty and conscience, found himself pushed toward an inevitable decision. He attempted a compromise, offering to release one prisoner to the crowd as was customary during Passover. He presented them with a choice: Jesus or Barabbas, a known insurrectionist. To Pilate's surprise, the crowd chose Barabbas, demanding Jesus' crucifixion. His heart heavy, Pilate felt the weight of the decision bearing down on him, yet he could not risk open conflict with the people and the priests. Reluctantly, he washed his hands before the crowd, declaring, "I am innocent of this man's blood." The crucifixion of Jesus haunted Pilate. He returned to Caesarea, his mind burdened by the events he had witnessed. The image of the man from Galilee, standing calm and resolute, haunted his dreams. He had condemned a man he believed to be innocent, yet he felt powerless to change his fate. In the quiet of his residence, he wondered if he had been part of something beyond his control, a force greater than Rome, greater than even his authority. As time passed, rumors spread of Jesus' resurrection, of his followers continuing his teachings, and of a growing movement that believed he was the promised Messiah. Pilate's name became entwined with the crucifixion, spoken in whispers, and in the prayers of those who mourned Jesus' death. His once promising career fell into uncertainty, overshadowed by the act he had reluctantly sanctioned. Years later, Pilate's life would end in ignominy. His career and reputation tarnished. Accounts of his death vary. Some say he was recalled to Rome and, in despair, took his own life. Others claim he was executed as punishment for his failures in Judea. Whatever the truth, Pontius Pilate's fate became a somber tale, a reminder of a man who, despite his power, found himself caught in a moment of history that was beyond his control. The story of Pilate became forever tied to the story of Jesus, a tragic testament to the burden of conscience and the cost of political power in a land as unyielding as Judea.